Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn. Delighted to be joined by Martin Jay, who's an award-winning journalist, editor of Maghrebi.org and Levantis.me. His career has spanned over 30 years, which has seen him work in over 50 countries for a host of big media titles. But what I love most is on his X page, he proudly proclaims that he's been fired by all the media giants. CNN say he's a good journalist, but a pain in the backside, and boy, do I know well how realistic that is. Welcome back. It's always good to have you, Martin.
Thanks for being back. Thanks for having me back.
Well done. I want to talk about your, let me call it an opinion piece on Nigel Farage, which has just been released. I want to start off just by reading the opening. It says, backstabbing Farage gives kiss of death to his own dream of being PM. You go on to say Farage's problems today with the Rupert Lowe scandal are of his own making and go way back. There is much to do with his jealousy and insecurity and his obsession to destroy any alpha males as they are to do with his needs to be more attractive to women. The history of Farage and the parties he creates is a shocking story of sex, lies, and treachery, and his own failure to be a lady killer. Martin, you paint a very vivid picture of your opinion of Nigel Farage as a man driven, as you say, by jealousy, insecurity, and a need for control. What first led you to see through what you call the Nigel effect, the charisma that kept his flaws hidden for so long?
Well, I first met Farage in 2002. Now, I'd been in Brussels, but at that time, 7 years, I was a freelance foreign correspondent for a number of Eurosceptic British newspapers. And in 2002, I set up with someone else a satirical magazine called The Sprout. And so in 2002, Farage wasn't really at all well known. I mean, he was quite an obscure figure even then, even though he'd been an MEP for a number of years. But I met him in his office. I interviewed him as he went through almost an entire packet of Rothman Blue cigarettes. I mean, the room was just full of smoke. He was a bit nervous. I don't think he'd done journalist interviews before then. But it occurred to me then, when I spoke to him, that he was incredibly thin-skinned. And I did think at the time, what an extraordinary handicap to have as a politician. Sometimes in my profession, we come across very occasionally journalists who are the same. And, colleagues usually pat them on the back and say, look, is this career path really for you if they're young? Because it's such a cutthroat business. And I think the same thing in politics. It's incredibly aggressive, very, very competitive. And you can't really expect to be taken seriously or even survive, I think, if you're really going to take every, hurty word so personally. But to answer your question, I think it came about a few weeks later when I was in the pub with him and his entourage and Annabelle Fuller, who just did this silly kiss. I mean, she didn't fancy me or anything. I'm not deluded about my own charm or good looks. She just kissed me, I think, because she wanted to wind him up, and it worked. And he took it very, very badly. And then from that moment onwards, I noticed that he was actually, despite being very, very confident as a public speaker and as a political figure, the flip side of that is I noticed he was very, very insecure with women. And I think that plays, to a certain extent, a role in the whole making of Farage and where he's been and where he came from and where he is today. I use those words, deceit, treachery, lies. These are all the sort of Brighton Rock, internal lettering of the UKIP brand or the Brexit brand or reform or whatever you want to call it, and part of that core, that trilogy of uh, uh, of ideas is narcissism. At the center of that is narcissism. And I think Nigel is, he'll forgive me for saying this, I hope, but I think he is a narcissist. And in politics there are quite a few narcissists. It's in one way, it's how you survive. You narcissists. I'm married to a narcissist. I've read hundreds of articles about narcissism and what it is. It helped my marriage because my wife is a narcissist, and narcissists are not necessarily people who love themselves. They are people who think they are the only person who counts. They are the only person in the room. They're the only person in the photograph. If you say to a narcissist, I've got a headache, their reply will be, I've got a migraine. If you say I've got backache, they'll say I think I've dislocated my shoulder. Because they don't want they don't want you to have any bandwidth of attention. And even if that attention span is seconds, they don't think you deserve it. They want to take it all. And Farage is a narcissist, and I think in the early days I noticed that. But the UKIP brand from the very, very beginning, and I think I allude to this in the article, the what he created at the very beginning was an entourage of narcissists and sycophants who all realized that what was required of them. And the Rupert Lowe, as I suggest in the title of the article, the Rupert Lowe scandal is really, it's very much about Nigel really not coping with anybody who takes that bandwidth, who takes that media spotlight. He couldn't do it in the early days, and he can't do it now. And I think the Spectator recently wrote an article which was pretty lame, actually. They sort of did a listicle of 12 people he's fallen out with over the years, many of them MEPs. And the real story, if you really want to understand Nigel and understand what he's doing with the party and why he's running into all these problems, you've got to go back into the UKIP period when I was in Brussels. And where I think Godfrey Bloom points out very well in an interview very recently, to hell with a dozen people Nigel fell out with. I mean, he fell out with probably more than 50, and at least these are party officials, these are MEPs who won a seat and wanted to have a say, in how the party was being run. And while I get some people who will stick up for him and say, look, when UKIP was very young, it needed a dictator because there were so many oddballs and weirdos, and to advance forward, it needed somebody with a sort of military kind of idea of having rule and order, and perhaps there's some truth in that. But one has to wonder how Farage goes ahead and faces a general election in, what is it, 3 years' time now, with the Reform Party, when he has the only thing he knows, the only business model he knows is a one-man band. As Godfrey Bloom points out, he doesn't like anybody around him who questions him, who takes the media spotlight, and Bloom points out in his interview that he reckons there's well over 50 people, 50 party officials and MEPs and even employees of UKIP, in that UKIP period in Brussels who he clashed with, who he couldn't cope with because they had a certain gift. It might have been a media quality, very good with journalists, or it might have been that they were good looking or clever or articulate. But whatever it was, Bloom just rattles them off, and he's quite sad about it. He's not at all passionate or angry. He's not bitter. He talks quite affectionately, I think, about Farage. But he says, look, this guy went to a decent public school, but he didn't do sport, and he didn't leave his public school and go to Sandhurst. And those two key components, Bloom reckons, made Farage what he is today. In other words, not a leader. He doesn't have what Bloom says is leadership quality, real leadership verve. And so from the very, very early days in UKIP, Nigel just basically destroyed people that stood in his way. And I think the sad thing is now that 20 years later, I mean, he spent 20 years, imagine 20 years of his adult life, the best years of his life in Brussels. But all this time later now, I think slowly all of these people are coming out and talking to journalists, talking to a lot of social media commentators. It's all online now. All of these people are coming out and they've all got their own particular individual take about Farage and what he's done. And he's done some pretty amazing things. I'm not a Farage hater, don't get me wrong. But they all come up with this common line that he just can't cope with other people being remotely dynamic. And I think that's
and you certainly in your piece, I mean, you argue that the clash with Rupert Lowe is a symptom of Nigel's deeper issues rather than an isolated spat. Do you think it really is as simple as that? You really think he's just a narcissist and can't stand anybody else in the limelight?
Yeah, because what are narcissists? Narcissists are people who are very, very unique. Narcissists take offense at other people stealing that media, stealing that attention, because they don't see it as you and I see it. They see it as an attack. And then the response is always a violent one. It's always a dramatic overreaction. I mean, look at what Farage has done. You know, he's basically he's backpedaled on some of his more polemic policy statements, and this Rupert Lowe has filled in the gap, the vacuum, and continued with them. The biggest one being immigration. And I'm sure that the statements that Lowe has made and the meetings, the interviews he's done with media, I think this has really hurt Farage a lot. I think he's taken it like someone's pushing an iron rod right through him, you know. And the reaction is always an overreaction. And I think he probably regrets it now. He probably regrets that he's done what he always does. This is always what happens with Nigel. He starts a smear campaign against someone. And the genius of it is he doesn't do it himself. He very cleverly informs his sycophants what the key messages should be to leak to journalists. And the fact that in the middle of all this, people were talking about senior reform figures telling journalists that Rupert Lowe was senile or having early signs of dementia. All this is defamatory. You know, this is all defamation law, as you know very well, because you're a barrister. You know, and it's taken Rupert Lowe. He must be a bit naive. I think maybe he thought that there was a procedure to go through with Nigel. Maybe this was just one of the many spats that you'd go through, and you'd invite him for dinner, as he did, and you get over it. But Nigel doesn't forgive and forget. You know, he's a very petulant individual, and he's quite nasty. And he's seen Lowe as not just somebody who takes his media spotlight, but I think possibly even outshines him. You know, and look, the point that Bloom made, I think brilliantly, which I mentioned in my article, is that when you're on the periphery of politics, when you're in European elections or council elections, for example, there's a big difference between how you behave and how your party should behave and how your party functions. Big politics, you need heavyweights next to you in the room. You need powerful people who understand business, who understand industry, who understand taxation, who understand government. You know, Nigel doesn't even have a chief of staff, you know, in his office. He doesn't even have a decent media advisor. And it's because he believes that the model that did very well for him in European elections, and now probably will do very well for him, I'm sure, in council elections, the one-man band, will ride him through and take him to the general elections. And I'm absolutely certain, as Bloom is, it won't, because people are very hypocritical. You know, they may even tell people who do the polls, you know, that I'll vote for Farage. They may even sign up for party membership. But when it comes to the day, when you put that cross in the box, you know, people in Britain have proved to be habitually conservative small c, as they vote. They generally go with what they always go with. And, you know, when you're heading to the polls and you're a few months away from the polls and journalists start looking at you and start looking at the people you've got behind you, next to you, who are you're presenting as provisional cabinet ministers. You know, he hasn't got it. Who's he got? He's got no one next to him. You know, Rupert Lowe was probably the best that he had. Who you could see Rupert Lowe as a cabinet minister. You could easily see him as a Home Office minister or a health minister or something. But the others, you know, without wanting to be nasty, I don't have any axe to grind against the others, but I don't see them as cabinet ministers. And I think that will be the crunch
Yeah.
on
I
the
mean, the, the
polling day.
one the one thing that Nigel did do is he picked the sort of central issue, which was of beating concern, if you like, for the British public about sort of immigration, and he had the rhetoric. He would say that he drove through Brexit again on that sort of side, and finally, after 8 attempts, he was elected as an MP. I know people who are very connected who actually started the party. Obviously, Richard Tyson, David Bull, who's shared a studio with them many times, and they've taken sort of different sides, if you like, to make way for Nigel. I mean, how do you think his sort of way that he's dealt with Lowe and others really reflects his leadership style? Do you think he is a leader? Does it make sense, or is he just really a one-man band?
I think you know the answer to that, don't you, Andrew? You know from reading my article that I don't think he is a leader. I really don't. And that's the big problem. You know, he'd get my vote if he would stick to his hardcore policies on immigration, but he's shifted so much. Now he's almost taken the central ground and taken the Labour position just to shrug his shoulders and say, look, we can't do mass deportations. Bullshit. You can do deportations if you're in power. So are you saying to us then you don't have the confidence in yourself that you will be prime minister one day, or are you saying that you've already written off that because something or somebody else has influenced you away from that policy decision? Very, very suspicious. I take a very skeptical view of why Farage is shifting to the centre ground and becoming much more of a globalist now and praising Tony Blair. And, so I think it's all, my central theme of the article is deceit, lies, and treachery. And I think that's the treachery which doesn't stand you in good stead over a long period of time in politics. And I think it's the treachery which will pull Nigel down. For me, as a journalist, I look at it from perhaps a slightly different perspective. One of the things Nigel did, and one of the reasons why he's failing so much, because he doesn't have advisors. He won't have advisors around him who will tell him what he doesn't want to hear. He just won't do that. And I think if you're going to go into big politics, you absolutely have to do that. You have to employ people who've got the experience and who will tell you, no, boss, that's a bad decision. We shouldn't do that. And these are the reasons why. No one's done that with Farage. And I think that's catching up on him now. Now as he metamorphosized from fringe politics to mainstream politics, I think it's going to pay a very, very heavy price. But it's the underhand and dirty style, of the treachery and the lies over the years, the amount of people that he's backstabbed, I think is really the critical issue, because two things emerge from this, which I point out in my very long piece. One of the genius things that Farage did over 20 years, I can say this with my hand on my heart, is that, and he doesn't know this, so I'll give him some news. As an old journalist who's been in the game a long time, journalists love Nigel Farage. Listen to me, Nigel. Watch my lips. They love you. He has this complex he carries around, this persecution complex, which I saw in the early days of Brussels, because it was different in Brussels. You had left-wing press that were out to get him, of course. But as he transitioned to national politics and he built reform, what I noticed is that journalists on both sides of the aisle like the guy a lot, really a lot. I mean, we love people who are a character. We love people who, when we traipse across London to a press conference, we know they're going to give us something. There's a lot of politicians in Parliament who wouldn't do that. So we like a safe bet, and Farage is a safe bet. So he doesn't have media advisors telling him that. He still believes that media are out to get him, And guess what? I think they will at a certain point if he carries on the way he's carrying on. I think until now, every journalist who's known him has given him a wide berth. Every journalist who's known him in Brussels and in London has given him quite a lot of slack. And because he's the outsider, and they've liked him, he's always been a good laugh off camera in the pub, and journalists like that. So they haven't touched on the subjects of his infidelity, for example, which is pretty well known. They haven't touched on the subjects of his treachery, how he sticks the knife in people's back, so habitually, so relentlessly over such a long period, that there's a whole trail of dead bodies now behind him. There's just buckets of blood and gore all over the place where this crazy leader is just stabbed and stabbed and keeps on
I think, I
stabbing
mean,
to
it's
this day.
in the interest of fairness, and as a brilliant journalist, you sort of
Oh, go on then.
recognise this. I think the reality is he's not here to answer for himself, so it's worth sort of digging a bit deeper into some of the accusations. Let me put it that way. You mentioned, let's go back to Brussels in 2002. You say you witnessed his thin-skinned nature firsthand. Tell me a bit more about that encounter, your Annabelle Fuller kiss that shaped your view of his character over the years.
Well, I mean, he always had a real problem with me because like, it started with the kiss, but it also I became very close friends with Annabelle, and we hung out a lot, and I think he was very concerned that she would pass on snippets of pillow talk to me, or even that the fact that Annabelle was very, very young, and she was very clever, and
Tell us
probably
what her background is. I mean, for people who don't know about Annabelle Fuller, tell us about her.
well, I don't know what she did before she came to Brussels. She was basically a student. I mean, I think it was her first job. But she was one of these very few people who was a natural press officer. She understood how media works for the very, very simple reason that she listened to journalists. She would go out with journalists to the pub and she'd listen to them bitch all night about their work environment and the problems they were having. And she was a good listener. And I think she brought that to the UKIP press office and was quite brilliant at what she did. And for a while Nigel was having this fling with her, which he wasn't very discreet about, we have to say, for a while, she basically, I think, created Brand Nigel in those 2 years, so that when he went to the European elections of 2004 and had the landslide, that got even more. I think it was 15. Someone will correct me. But that was a lot of it was partly to do with Annabelle advising him on all sorts of things, advising him on how to handle interviews, advising him on internal political scrums that were going on. So she was a very young and bright person that was close to him and got really, really badly betrayed by him. I mean, when we talk about betrayal and treachery, she paid a very, very high price because the party turned on her. And he didn't really do anything about that. He just stepped back and watched it and let it happen. And it got really, really nasty. And, the stuff that was written online about her, the witch hunt that was carried out when he got tired of her, he just I don't know if you've ever gone on a fox hunt and you've seen what dogs do to a fox. It's something you'll never forget the rest of your life, limbs being pulled. That's what basically Farage did to Annabelle Fuller. And it drove her towards a nervous breakdown, to being suicidal, towards getting therapy and reinventing her life now in the obscurity of the provinces in England, doing public relations for various companies to rebuild herself. She had to change her name. That was just one. Well, I mean, I could probably give you a dozen, but that's just one example that I saw firsthand. I witnessed it
No,
firsthand.
I think we've got time to unpack it. And I think this is
Yeah.
so important. It's such
Then the second one, to expand, when I saw 2004 come and the European elections roll out, and suddenly you had a new team of UKIP MEPs that almost broke the mold on the previous one, because the previous one, 1999 to 2004, was basically old blokes with big bellies who wanted to cheat on their wives. That was their raison d'être. They all were in Brussels because they wanted to cheat, to basically to cheat on their wives and to look for some sexual fun. And the new lot that came in, there was a few bright people, there was some younger people, but as Bloom points out, by the time we got to the end of that 5-year term, more than half of those MEPs had clashed with Nigel and had their whip removed. So they were no longer in UKIP. That's a shocking legacy to have behind your shoulder, that you just can't get on with people. I'm thinking of there's a couple of people that spring to mind that were probably brilliant and could be absolutely superb shadow cabinet ministers today in his party. One is Stephen Wolfe, who was a very clever, good-looking young lawyer from Manchester, who journalists immediately loved in Brussels. He was articulate, he was cool with the cameras, and he came across as being very down to earth. But he had ideas. He had ideas, and I think Farage immediately saw a contender there. He immediately saw this is somebody who could actually take power away from me. So they clashed, and it was ugly, and it even resulted in a punch-up in a pub in Strasbourg where Stephen ended up in hospital. I mean, it's all in cuttings now. It's all on the internet. You can read about it. But the one figure that sticks out, I suppose if we look at the spectrum of people that were sycophantic to Nigel and stayed with him for a long time, compared to the friends, the real friends. Even Nigel puts the knife in the back of his friends. I mean, Godfrey Bloom was one of the nicest and funniest people you could ever meet in Brussels. I mean, journalists loved him because he was so funny. And he just had just so many anecdotes and so many funny stories. And he didn't have any airs or graces. He was at the end of his career. He didn't give a toss about European Union and what he was doing with UKIP. He was just there for the laugh. And we loved him. I mean, the European Parliament is generally a really boring place to hang out. It's 600 MEPs who are just the most dullest people you could ever imagine to find. And you've got Bloom, who's probably the funniest person in the whole Parliament. If you were with Godfrey Bloom in the pub and the power was cut and the barman said, "We've got no pumps to give you beer," you'd probably sit there for an hour in the dark just to hang out with him because he was that funny. So he started to get more media attention for all the wrong reasons, you could say. He hit a journalist over the head in London with a rolled up magazine. and he had his comment about bongo bongo land, and he used this word sluts, which the modern interpretation of the word is not the same as its classic interpretation, and it backfired on him.
Well, what's
And
the classic interpretation? I mean, just unpack both of
I
those.
think I think the classic I think I'm going to be corrected, hopefully, but I think the classic interpretation is just not very clean women who are literally, through women who work in physical jobs and are not very clean. I think that's it. But it's
Yeah,
been
but
turned
anybody, I
into
mean, just on that though, Martin, anybody who's intelligent and know you've got a room full of press will know that they're going to latch on to bongo bongo land as a comment. They're going to
sure,
latch on to the word
sure,
slut. He's not a
sure.
stupid man, is he?
No, no, he's not at all stupid. I'm not saying that. But Godfrey, as far as I know, I mean, Farage doesn't really have friends. He's not really a man's man. But Godfrey was a close friend of his, and the relationship went really belly up to the point where Godfrey lost his whip. I mean, basically, Nigel kicked him out of the party. You
But
know,
what was that
and
because of his statements? I
well,
mean,
hang on,
as
let
you
me explain.
say,
Let me explain. The
yeah.
thing that really annoyed Farage repeatedly over several months was it wasn't that Bloom was getting into the press for all these rather polemic and somewhat politically incorrect statements.
Yeah.
It was the fact that he was just getting coverage, you know. And when you hang out with these MEPs and you see the things that are important to them, like their 3-minute speeches in Parliament, they all got off on that. I was in Strasbourg with them a few times, and they all pat each other on the back, and and there's a lot of really quite awful sycophancy in these moments. But Bloom was getting a lot of media attention, and he had some ideas of his own. He had some ideas about, and as Bloom points out in his recent interview he's done on YouTube, which you should watch. It's actually very good because he's not a bitter man at all, not at all. He speaks quite affectionately about Farage. But what he said is, look, if you can't run a party like this, you can't run a company. If you're a CEO of a company, you'd want top people, with you in the boardroom because you can't be an expert on everything, and Bloom says he was the CEO of some financial services company in the past, and he had these other people, 2 or 3 other people with him who were specialists in their field. And he paints the picture, look, I couldn't have done it without them. I couldn't have been the CEO of that company. And it beggars belief how Nigel thinks from as early as 2014 that he can do without people like Godfrey Bloom and Stephen Wolfe. Both of those people would be great cabinet ministers. Bloom messed around a lot in Brussels because he didn't take the EU seriously and he didn't take being an MEP seriously. But I think if he was offered a position as a shadow cabinet minister, I think he would take it very seriously indeed. He does have a pedigree in business. He has worked in some top jobs for some top companies. He does understand banking. He does understand how industry works. He'd be a brilliant spokesman for small businesses, for example. And Bloom points out that one of the things that frustrated him in that period of 2014 is that there were a few people who came forward who could have been brilliant MEPs, who could have been, even if they weren't, if they couldn't become MEPs and couldn't be given seats, they could be at least given very good positions in the party as spokespersons. And one of them was a Scottish dentist who was brilliant with journalists. Another one was a retired, I think, Air Force officer, Air Force or Army, someone will correct me, who would have, in his words, would have been absolutely superb as a defense spokesman as well. Both of these people, didn't get anywhere because Nigel didn't like them, because he saw them as being dynamic, as being media friendly, media savvy, I should say, and would cause him problems and cause him headaches. I mean, one of the things that Farage doesn't want to do and has never liked to do is actually run the party. He's not somebody who runs the party. He's not interested in meetings. He's not interested in all those endless meetings that you need to have. He's not interested in people's opinions. He has a shocking contempt for the members, even that there's no. I mean, one of the points that Rupert Lowe has made a few times on Twitter in the last week is, why not put this to the members? Why not have a referendum to the members about such things that we're clashing over, like mass deportations? But Farage is not interested. He has a contempt for the members, as he has a contempt for everybody in his own party. The only people he has any time for at all is that tiny little group of sycophants around him who just basically agree with everything he says, because he doesn't really want to be, he doesn't want to have the responsibility of being the party boss. He only wants to have the glory and the media limelight that comes
But
with
are
it.
you calling people like, I mean, Richard Tyson, Lee Anderson don't come across as sycophants, and they themselves are very forthright in their opinions. Are you say they're just all bowing at the altar of Nigel Farage?
Perhaps, perhaps not. They're not quite so obvious. You wouldn't think so, but you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. I mean, Tice did stamp down to bring Farage back when Reform Party was just a name. When the snap election was called. You don't know what's going on in behind closed doors. You don't know how the conversations. To go back to Bloom, one of the points he makes in his interviews is he would be very surprised if there's not another scalp in the next few months or leading up to the general election. I don't know who that would be. Possibly Lee Anderson, because Lee Anderson was previously an MP, so maybe he has a certain swagger about him, which might be starting to
They
annoy.
both have shows on GB News.
Do they? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh no, Lee Anderson's got a brilliant show. Nigel's got a brilliant show. As
all
you know,
right.
I've shared studios or the TV
Well, yeah,
studio.
I mean, to say something in Nigel's favor, because people will think I hate him, when in those early days, I hung out with him, he did mention that he might consider going into broadcast, and I encouraged him. And I said, you'd be probably quite good at it,
Yeah.
but take advantage of all the cameras now pointing at you to do your own media training and get familiar with, doing pieces to camera. And it turned out he was very good. It turned out that he actually did have a natural gift staring at that little tiny black lens that you and I know so well. He got it. So he always has that fallback plan. But, it's the deceit and treachery and the lies and, just, yeah, I mean, I kind of try and list them in he can't, I think there's a problem with twisting the truth in reform. And my point I was trying to make before we went off on a different tangent, is that special relationship that Farage has with journalists for so long, which is his genius, actually. I think it will come to an end 3 months before the general elections. And the power of the Conservatives and Labour with their relationships with media, with their conglomerates who are supporting them, and the public relations machine that they will have, I think we will see a different approach from media towards Farage. And a lot of these half-truths and lies and the attacks and the smears, it's all going to come out in a big concentration in one lump. And, if Farage hasn't got a savvy media guy, look, I mean, there are hundreds of journalists my age who did the 25 years in Westminster Village for the Nationals, are out of work now. Find one, who doesn't care about his career, who's got nothing to lose, who will tell you what you don't want to hear. Get yourself a decent bloody media advisor. You had Gwen Toler, for Christ's sake, for 20 years. And where did it take you? All I see every single day now is just a media catastrophe, catastrophe after catastrophe. And how Nigel is talking to journalists now, and how he's actually speaking to them with this extraordinary, I can only think of the word in French, mépris, contempt. The contempt is just extraordinary. And it's starting. And so that special relationship he had for so long, I think is going to destroy. I think this is going to be one of his downfalls, that he doesn't have a decent media advisor. He doesn't believe in having advisors to give him advice about how to go on. I think I keep talking about the treachery, the lies, and the deceit and the sex, because there's a lot of sex in this story, or there's a lot of lack of sex, which I think is also part of the problem. I've always thought that when Nigel in the early days used to cry on people's shoulders in pubs in Brussels, mine including a few others, that he felt very disappointed in his life because some of his friends who worked in the city, had were earning huge salaries and had huge properties. I think this is all about really, it's all about power and women to me. And I'm
Well,
probably the only one.
we're going to unpack that a little bit more, but for now, we're going to take a break. Martin J, thank you very much for joining me.